I signed the divorce papers sitting at a plastic table in a courthouse hallway that smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, while my husband signed his with a pen that cost more than my entire week of groceries. And, yeah, that contrast pretty much summed up our marriage right there. He didn't look nervous, didn't hesitate, just smiled like a man finally cutting loose something heavy, something inconvenient. In his mind, I was the reason his life felt small. I was the cashier wife, the woman with tired eyes and practical shoes, the weight tied to his ankle while he swore he was meant to swim with sharks. That morning, before we walked into that building, I had stood at the bus stop counting quarters, wondering if I could afford the ride or if I'd have to walk the 40 minutes to my shift. He watched me from his car engine running suit pressed, scrolling through his phone, and said nothing. That silence wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. He wanted me to feel it. He wanted me to understand my place. His name was Ethan Brooks. Mine was, and still is, Claire Morgan. We met in college when we were both broke and idealistic, when ramen noodles felt like a shared adventure instead of a warning sign. Back then, he told me I grounded him. Later, he said I held him back. Funny how those words mean the same thing until ambition gets involved. For years, I supported his dreams while quietly shrinking my own. When he failed his licensing exam, I picked up extra shifts. When he decided law wasn't his calling anymore and pivoted into corporate consulting, I paid for the courses. I walked to work in the rain so he could take ride shares to meetings, terrified someone important might see him arrive on foot. He called it image management. I called it survival. By the time we were living in that narrow apartment with the rattling heater and the flickering bathroom light, his patience with me had evaporated. Every conversation felt like an audit. Why was dinner so simple? Why did I worry about bills? Why couldn't I think bigger? Dream louder. Stop acting poor. That word became his favorite insult. Poor mindset, poor energy, poor ambition. The night he packed his bag, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no plates breaking. He just stood there folding expensive shirts into a leather duffel while I sat on the edge of the bed, hands locked together so tightly my fingers went numb. He said he needed space. He said he had opportunities. He said he couldn't keep dragging someone forward who refused to run. I remember nodding like I understood, even thanking him for being honest. That's how small I had learned to make myself. What he didn't tell me was that he already had somewhere to go. A high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a woman named Vanessa Cole waiting inside. She was polished, wealthy, connected. The kind of woman who talked about brunch like it was a strategy meeting. She drove a silver sports car and laughed like nothing had ever cost her effort. The papers came the next day. No warning, no conversation. Just a stranger at my door, and Ethan standing down the hall dry under an umbrella, Vanessa's hand tucked into his elbow like she'd always belonged there. He told me he'd terminated the lease, said I had one day to leave. One day to erase a life I'd spent years holding together with duct tape and hope. That night I slept in a bus terminal clutching my coat and my pride, telling myself this was temporary, that things fall apart before they get better. I didn't know then how literal that statement was about to become. 3 days later, exhausted, hungry, and numb, I was sitting in a small, all-night diner just to stay warm, when an older man in a dark coat approached me. He asked my name carefully like he was afraid it might break. When I confirmed it, his shoulders sagged in relief. He told me he'd been looking for me for nearly a week, that he represented an estate, that my name had been at the top of a file no one had opened in decades. The story sounded unreal at first. A distant relative I barely remembered. Old land purchases, trusts, and holding companies. Property under office towers and retail blocks I'd walked past my entire life without knowing I owned the ground beneath them. When he said the valuation out loud, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to accept it. I kept waiting for the catch, the fine print. The moment someone would tell me there'd been a mistake, but there wasn't. The truth was simple and absurd. While Ethan had been calling me poor, counting my pennies, mocking my caution, I had unknowingly inherited a fortune built quietly, patiently, without flash or ego. The next months were not glamorous, they were brutal. Meetings that lasted all day. contracts that made my head spin. Learning a language of power I'd never been invited to speak before. I didn't buy sports cars or designer bags. I bought time. I bought advisors. I bought knowledge. I rebuilt myself from the inside out, piece by piece, shedding the version of me that apologized for existing. Meanwhile, Ethan was thriving, or so it looked from the outside. Promotions, networking events, photos online of champagne glasses and skyline views. He told anyone who would listen that leaving me had been the best decision of his life, that cutting loose dead weight had finally let him fly. Then came the letter. The company Ethan worked for leased one of my properties. A long-term lease, comfortable outdated, profitable for them, and insulting for me. When the estate officially transferred a clause, activated one they'd ignored for years. They had 30 days. Ethan volunteered to handle it. Of course he did. He'd always believed he could talk his way out of gravity. He walked into that conference room, confident rehearsed, wearing the watch Vanessa bought him, ready to negotiate with some faceless entity he assumed was old money and easily flattered. He didn't expect me. I watched the recognition spread across his face like a slow-motion car crash. Shock, disbelief, panic, all layered beneath a desperate attempt to regain control. He tried to joke. Then he tried to charm. Then when that failed, he tried to rewrite history, telling me his cruelty had been motivation, that he'd pushed me toward this success. He said we could fix things now, that together we'd be unstoppable. I listened without interrupting. When he finally ran out of words, I told him the lease could be renewed. Relief flooded his face. Then I explained the condition. The company could stay. He couldn't. It wasn't personal, I said calmly. It was structural. Risk management. Values. The board would understand. And they did. An hour later, security escorted him out of the building he thought defined him. The same halls he'd strutted through for years suddenly felt hostile, watching final. By the time he reached the sidewalk, his access was gone. His job was gone. His leverage evaporated in real time. He called Vanessa from the curb, rain soaking into his suit, voice shaking as he explained. She listened, then told him the wedding was off. Her father didn't do business with liabilities. It was a bad look. A year after that, I attended a charity event in a ballroom overlooking the city. I stood near the windows listening to conversations about development and responsibility when I noticed a man arguing with a street vendor below, counting coins with shaking hands. I recognized him instantly. Not because he looked powerful, but because he didn't. Our eyes met for a second. He waited for a reaction. Anger, satisfaction, anything. I gave him nothing. Then I turned away. That moment wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. About realizing that the person who once made me feel small had no power over me anymore, not because I'd become rich, but because I'd become whole. So, here's my question to you. Was this justice, or was it cruelty dressed up as karma? Was I right to draw that line, or did I cross one? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know where you stand, because stories like this aren't just about money. They're about how we treat people when we think they're disposable.